the book being, of course, this one, They Killed Freddie Gray, The Anatomy of a Police Brutality Cover-Up by Justine Barron. And a forward by Rabia Chaudhry, who was, of course, working with Adnan Saeed, right? Who his whole case is crazy. But very interesting. So I'll come back to that in a second. But I wanted to start by playing, which will give me a quick break, play a segment from the Remix Morning Show from a year or two ago. I can't even remember now, when Justine joined us. And I'll put I'll remind you, I'll put the link in the show description, but of course it's on Black Liberation Media Remix Morning Show playlist. But I just want to play this clip because it's her answering a question that I've wanted to have answered for a long time, that I got more to learn more about in her book, that she does address, thankfully. The book is damn good. Exactly. You're right. It really is. And I'm just late to getting to it. But so let me play this clip. After what you've talked about so far this morning has occurred, Freddie is grabbed up, he's killed. There's this absurd investigation and first trial. I'm curious, having not had a chance to see your book yet, do you get into what happens immediately after that in terms of the uprising, and the origins of that? I am still fascinated by what little, in quote unquote, investigating I've done, and when I was there trying to pay attention. The story of the uprising and the protests to me seems highly suspicious and suspect. So after that preamble, my first question, to invite you to share what you learned about that, is where is that first tweet that of the purge in the schools? Did you get into that, and and could you talk about that, and what you've uncovered?
Thank you so much for asking me, because I've done a little handful of interviews and nobody's asked me about this, and it's really one of my favorite chapters in the book. I definitely do. The story of the uprising is not as it was told. It seems like you're aware. So where I come from is twofold. The first is the story of the organizing on the ground and what really happened at the beginning. I think people don't understand that this came out of his neighborhood, that they were his neighbors, many of them witnesses, who literally just marched to the police station because they were tired during that week of silence before he died, and demanded answers, and that grew. And so the story of movement building was something that I talk about. And then, of course, the story of what happened when there were 2 nights of rioting. The first one was a bit more organic because they marched to the Oriole Stadium, and some clashes happened, but it wasn't exactly organic. There were police kettling protesters. So what happened then on Monday was the night of the funeral. And so I definitely break that down. The rioting started because police provoked them. There was nothing going to happen that day. The story of what happened at Penn North is bizarre. And it is about police allowing certain actions, provoking them, parking a police car in the middle of the street and letting it sit there for hours, having police cars catch fire suspiciously and letting them sit there for hours, having a whole line of cops around the corner from the CVS standing there while hundreds of people go in and out looting it. So this was, if there was a purge, so you spoke about the purge, there were a couple of propaganda campaigns that day by the police department designed to provoke a riot. And I think it's very, some people might hear that and be like, oh, what? No. But this happens, and I talk about the history, like the Miami model being this kind of common model in policing these days, that when there's a mild protest, they try to spin it into something violent. And Commissioner Batts at the time actually already had a history of this in Oakland. So yeah, I definitely lay this out, and I'm really glad you asked about it, because I've been wanting to talk about it.
Yeah, no, I can't wait to I do want to start here, folks. I know folks. Well, that's with the forward from Rabia Chaudhry, who worked to exonerate Adnan Saeed, who was wrongfully convicted of murder. In that case, of course, a lot of you, I'm sure, from the podcast Serial. But she makes a really good, important point here. She says what Serial did not bring, that is the podcast and then the subsequent news and all the other coverage, was a critical gaze, much less an interrogation toward a criminal justice system and the actors in it that would lead to an innocent person being convicted of a crime he did not commit. The complete failure of that wildly phenomenal show to investigate and report on the endemic corruption and history of misconduct inside the Baltimore Police Department led to the launch of my own podcast, Undisclosed. So she rightfully connects that misconduct to and the environment to what happened to Syed happening to Freddie, to that which would happen to Freddie Gray. The story of what was done to Freddie Gray, both in his life and afterward, is a masterclass in how authorities are able to manipulate and misdirect attention of the public away from the facts and real issues at play, and how media is complicit in the propaganda, or as some pointedly call it, copaganda. Police department's narratives about the legality of his detainment, that is Gray's detainment, arrest, injury, and ultimate death, mainstream media did no better. If anything, they caused even greater damage than conservative media by willingly entertaining and keeping the public engrossed in the 24-hour news cycle of red herrings. The widespread use of passive, non-accusatory word tragedy might have made Freddie Gray a sympathetic character, but it did so at the cost of the truth of the matter. By the way, I'm glad I highlighted that in a different color, just to draw my attention, as a reminder. This is, by the way, this is exactly my problem with. This is exactly what was said earlier tonight about Fred Hampton being an unsympathetic character and therefore being unworthy of the church committee, unsympathetic to whites in particular, and therefore being unworthy of church committee investigation. My entire now catalog of criticism of Ryan Coogler films is that all of them involve a similar humanizing or intent to create a sympathetic figure out of Black people for white people to be willing to support these films, both in funding, willing to let him own them, and of course going to see them to generate the box office that has made him now the biggest Black box office draw in history. The unfortunate contradiction is that the sympathy, being sympathetic or seen as human to a white affluent community is has a lot to do with your literal survival and or how well your career goes. Very so that's so as we'll get to, Gray is killed by the police or in police custody. And then there's still this need to create or him as an unsympathetic character to justify it. If this angle was unconscionable, the idea of spreading through the media that Freddie Gray injured himself by banging around in the back of the van was irresponsible and reprehensible. The media just as uncritically turned an enamored eye to State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby. We'll come back to that a little bit. In 2014, before Gray's death, brutal killings of Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, and Tamir Rice were all caught on camera, and each sent the nation into a tailspin of rage and mourning, but no officers involved were ever prosecuted, much less served a day in prison. There might have been some convictions in the case in terms of Freddie Gray, had the state's attorney based their theory of the killing on the statements of many witnesses who stood watching, some recording on their cell phones, how Gray was handled by officers on the morning of April 12th, 2015. But most of these witnesses who could have demonstrated that Gray was killed not by a rough ride, but most likely by police actions at one of the van's notorious stops, none of them were called to testify. They were not called to testify. So the short of it is, and I don't know how much of this that I'll get to tonight or stay, but the short of it is Freddie Gray, while living in the Gilmore Homes section, the Sandtown section of Baltimore, is what this chapter beautifully describes is how he's walking with friends. And CCTV catches all of this to corroborate. He's walking with friends doing nothing that could be considered certainly illegal. They're just hanging out, going, getting, going to the grocery store. They're, little stuff like that. And then all of a sudden, of course, cops see Freddie and his friends. They all this eye contact, as one of the officers would claim, is made, and they all run. They're chased. Officers on bicycles catch them, or catch Freddie, I should say. They catch Freddie. He is grabbed up, folded up, screaming in pain, what looks like through injuries sustained to his back before, and then they throw him in. Fact, this is Chitty Botch is right. They were, that was the extent of their criminality on that morning, being black. And he's thrown into this paddy wagon, to this police van, handcuffed. He's not secured. And as it says here, there's 42 unaccountable minutes between the time he's taken from there. And they do a good job of let me see if I can skip ahead to showing you a map of where Freddie was walking, where he's picked up, where the 6 stops take place. The van stops 6 times. Stop 1, Miller and Nero. These are 2 police officers. Stop Gray on Presbury Street and find an illegal knife, place in transport van. Right, that was the other thing. They said they found a switchblade, which is illegal. What this book does is a great job of is explaining some of the context as to why he would have had a knife, what kind of life he was living, where, the environment, the the amount of arrests that Freddie had. He was constantly being arrested. There was even some erroneous claims that he was a snitch, but that wasn't the case. It was just that he was he was just a poor black person living in a poor community who was engaged in low-level drug activity at most. So you put all that together, and you get all of that. So, but the idea that he was, some grander threat than that. I mean, there was discussions of him. The book talks about his overcoming lead poisoning and the effects of that on his development. To what extent that plays a part, the book, and I'm certainly not sure. But they grab Freddie up. They grab Freddie up. The second stop, 7 minutes later, bike cops shackle Gray's legs and at Mount and Baker Street and prepare him for transport to Central Booking. Stop 3, 10 minutes later, another police officer checks out the back of the van at Fremont and Mosher, because there's a debate as to whether he was screaming or was not screaming, whether he was throwing himself around in the van, whether he was not throwing himself around in the van. Stop 4, 3 minutes after that, Porter checks on Gray at Druid and Hill at Dolphin Streets. Stop 5, about 11 minutes later, bike cops put second prisoner in van. Sergeant White checks on Gray. And then stop 6, police is 7 minutes after that. Police find Gray unconscious at the Western District Police Station. Yeah, Stewart Hall. Because this is exactly, and shout out to Dr. Orasambi Burton for getting me to go back and look at it. But Policing the Crisis, this is exactly what Hall and his colleagues were talking about in terms of the relationship between the police, the courts, and the media, creating a narrative that justifies the police violence against the African community and using it to its benefit. I mean, Gray's death was one of the most reported stories in the United States during 2015. I think this is a great point to make, because again, being in the middle of it don't mean you get it, and just because there's a lot of people talking about something does not mean they're saying something correct, sinners. Excuse me, sorry. Sorry about that. Just because a lot of people got a lot to say about it doesn't mean that a lot of goodness, a lot of clarity, or a lot of analysis is being brought. In addition to the daily news reports, there were longer stories in all of these TV and films people saw, and I remember that HBO Baltimore Rising. I didn't see the CNN. I wouldn't have watched the CNN documentary, as they call it, but I did watch the HBO Baltimore Rising, and I actually remember reaching out to a few folks who were filmed in that and asked them for their thoughts, because that film was wild, including that, including juxtaposing the police killings and violence with the police hanging out and doing cookouts with something like that with the community, something like that. And I mean that not in a critical way, by the way. They weren't doing it in a critical way, is what I'm saying. But none really aspired to uncover what happened to Gray. There's a huge gap between the amount of proverbial ink and video hours spent by news outlets discussing the case and the percentage of accurate content they reported, which can only be judged in retrospect with evidence in hand.
Now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
But that's bars right there. There's a huge gap between the amount of proverbial ink and video hours spent by news media outlets discussing the case and the percentage of accurate content they reported. You might even be able to say there's an inverse relationship between the amount of coverage and the amount of accuracy. A case in point is the sheer number of stories that discussed rough rides in the context of Gray's death simply because officials decided it happened in the van. In other words, they didn't want to acknowledge it, that when they grabbed him up and folded him up on the parking lot, on the sidewalk, that they broke his back or did serious damage to him then, even though he was seen screaming on video. And they wanted to be able to say that, or to throw in there to muddy the analysis that he did it to himself. But again, as Stuart Hall and them pointed out, before manufacturing consent, again, shout out to Dr. Burton for that point, that narrative is set because it comes from police officials. They said that, so that's what became the narrative. Every bad media habit at once was at work: a reliance on police say journalism, passive voice reporting, the fetishization of mystery, tragedy and racial strife, and both sides reporting with shifting binaries. There was also gatekeeping by local reporters with arguable conflicts of interest in a town that is often called Smaltimore. And I do like that she points out that while Barack Obama was in the president, this is in the next chapter, they celebrated it as evidence of America's triumph over race and promised criminal justice reform. In fact, it revved up the drug war, the Obama administration, through even more funding for militarizing of the police, SWAT teams, pipeline drug task forces, and other drug war horrors than his Republican predecessor. But as she points out, this is very true. The Baltimore Uprising and the real story of how the Baltimore riots started similarly shows reform leaders promising reconciliation and understanding while using a massive police budget, militarized equipment, and propaganda campaign to control and suppress the movement to end police violence in Baltimore. In 2018, my attempt to not only commemorate the moment of the Kerner Commission anniversary, but the overlapped a little bit with what we were talking about with Barron there. And by the way, this is also a write-up that ends up describing the project that I would accuse some former colleagues of plagiarizing and turning into a grant. And if folks are interested in that full story, please do sign up either as a patron or a member and check out that, because it is painful and it pisses me off to this day. But in writing about the Kerner Commission, and part of what the Kerner Commission was talking about, of course, was uprisings and the police brutality that causes them, and then in this case, the media environment that does or does not cover these issues well, and the impact that poor coverage has. So I was arguing that the Race and Media Research Center that I was proposing would satisfy the call of the Kerner Commission 50 years earlier for an urban research institute that would help produce the research, that would provide the analyses that would help prevent these problems going forward. That was the pitch that I was making. So I included this section on media and rebellion, Kerner, the press, and the police in Baltimore, where I talked a little bit about the uprisings there around Freddie Gray and the poor police, the poor police, but the media analysis, and how what happened with Kerner, what it says with Kerner. As the Kerner Commission concluded, despite instances of sensationalism, inaccuracies, and distortions, newspapers, radio, and television on the whole made a real effort to give a balanced, factual account of the 1967 disorders. Despite this effort, the portrayal of violence that occurred last summer failed to reflect accurately its scale and character. The overall effect was, we believe, an exaggeration of both mood and event. Ultimately, most important, we believe that the media have thus far failed to report adequately on the causes and consequences of civil disorders and the underlying problems of race relations. It feels like, more or less, give or take some of the discussion of balanced accounts, that this is exactly what I was saying happened in 2015 with the case around with the uprising around Freddie Gray and its reporting. So I was just again, very happy to read Barron's book, because I had attempted here to look at some of what these claims were, where they were coming from. And long story short, much like she found with even more evidence, there was no evidence. And I did mention, I did remember to mention the claims of the white supremacists and the BGF. That was, the Baltimore Sun reported the Purge claim April 27, 2015, the day of Freddie Gray's funeral, which, along with later dismissed claims of the Black guerrilla family plans to attack police officers, and even report that students in local schools are being held in an assembly formation due to threats against them by unknown white supremacists, all led both to increased levels of intensity, which could predictably escalate, and, as was the case, provide the police and media with necessary narrative shift from police brutality to condemnation of violent protests. I'm not going to front, but I had that right on. I can't. I mean, I'll be self-critical when it warrants, but I was right about that. God damn it! And I don't think Barron includes this part in her book, the part about the white supremacists, and then they did. They turned it in. So I'll include the link in the show description if folks want to follow up with that as well.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.